Another day, another story. The U.S. national debt is the total amount of money that the federal government owes to creditors. This debt accumulates over time from borrowing to cover budget deficits, which occur when the government spending exceeds its revenue. As of October 2024, the U.S. national debt stands at over $33 trillion, and it continues to rise due to factors such as increased spending on social programs, defense, and interest payments, alongside lower tax revenues. Here are some key points about the U.S. debt. Welcome to Tabo Eminent Channel. Types of debt. Public debt. This is the portion of the debt held by external entities, such as individuals, companies, foreign governments, and other organizations. Intragovernmental holdings. This is debt held within government accounts, primarily from programs like Social Security and Medicare. Debt to GDP ratio. The debt to GDP ratio is a metric used to compare the nation's debt to its overall economic output, GDP. In 2024, the debt to GDP ratio is over 120%, meaning the debt is larger than the entire U.S. economy. This high ratio can raise concerns about long-term fiscal sustainability. Drivers of debt. Deficits. The U.S. has run budget deficits for most of the past few decades. Large deficits, particularly during recessions or times of crisis, e.g., COVID-19 pandemic, contribute significantly to debt growth. Entitlement programs. Spending on programs like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid continues to increase as the population ages. Interest on debt. As the debt grows, the interest payments on that debt also increase. Rising interest rates can further escalate these costs. Debt ceiling. The U.S. has a statutory limit on how much debt it can issue, known as the debt ceiling. Congress must periodically raise or suspend this ceiling to allow further borrowing. Debates over raising the debt ceiling can lead to political standoffs and economic uncertainty, as seen in recent years. Global implications. The U.S. dollar is the world's reserve currency, meaning the country can borrow more easily than others. However, concerns about debt can impact investor confidence, influence global financial markets, and affect the U.S. credit rating. Potential consequences. Higher interest rates. Persistent high debt levels may lead to higher interest rates, which can slow economic growth by making borrowing more expensive for businesses and consumers. Inflation. Excessive debt can lead to inflationary pressures if the government resorts to printing money to cover debt obligations. While there is ongoing debate about how urgent or serious the U.S. debt problem is, many economists agree that steps will be needed in the future to address the long-term fiscal challenges posed by rising debt levels. The growth of U.S. debt, a historical perspective post-World War II era. After World War II, the U.S. national debt was about 119% of GDP, but it steadily declined as the economy grew. The 1950s and 1960s saw strong economic growth and manageable debt levels due to a combination of higher taxes, disciplined spending, and the absence of large-scale wars. 1970s–1980s. Things started to change in the 1970s, with the Vietnam War and the introduction of large social programs, including Medicare and Medicaid, contributing to rising government expenditures. However, it was during the 1980s under President Ronald Reagan that the U.S. debt began to soar. Reagan's administration pursued significant tax cuts and increased military spending during the Cold War. 1990s. During the Clinton administration, the national debt's growth slowed as a result of a combination of tax increases, reduced military spending after the Cold War, and strong economic growth fueled by the tech boom. By the late 1990s, the U.S. was running budget surpluses. 2000s. The early 2000s saw a dramatic shift. The Bush administration's tax cuts, coupled with the cost of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, contributed to a resurgence in deficits. The global financial crisis of 2008–2009 also required massive government intervention, including bank bailouts and stimulus spending, to stabilize the economy. The Great Recession led to sharp declines in tax revenues, further ballooning the national debt. Recent years and the impact of COVID-19 2010s. After the financial crisis, the U.S. economy gradually recovered, but the national debt continued to rise. The Obama administration implemented policies to stabilize the economy, including the Affordable Care Act, which extended healthcare coverage to millions but also added to government spending. COVID-19 pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 represented one of the most significant economic shocks in modern history. In response, the federal government passed multiple relief packages worth trillions of dollars to support businesses, individuals, and healthcare systems. These measures were essential to prevent a total economic collapse but added trillions to the national debt. In 2020 alone, the U.S. government borrowed around $3.1 trillion, and the national debt surged past $27 trillion. The debt ceiling crises. The U.S. has a legal debt limit, known as the debt ceiling, which restricts how much the government can borrow. When the government approaches this limit, Congress must pass legislation to raise or suspend the ceiling. In recent years, political fights over the debt ceiling have led to significant economic uncertainty. The future of U.S. debt. Challenges and solutions. As the U.S. debt continues to grow, there are increasing concerns about its long-term sustainability. With the debt exceeding 120% of GDP, there is pressure on the government to either cut spending or raise revenues. However, both options come with challenges. Cutting spending. Reducing government spending would likely involve cuts to popular programs like Social Security, Medicare, and defense. These cuts could be politically unpopular and would have significant impacts on the elderly, low-income individuals, and the economy at large. Raising taxes. Increasing taxes, particularly on corporations and wealthy individuals, is another potential solution. However, tax hikes can slow economic growth if not carefully designed, and they tend to spark heated political debates. Entitlement reform. One area that experts often point to is the need for entitlement reform, particularly in Medicare and Social Security. As the population ages, these programs will place increasing pressure on the federal budget. Reforms could involve raising the retirement age, adjusting benefits, or modifying how these programs are funded. Economic growth. Sustained economic growth is one of the best ways to reduce the debt to GDP ratio. A strong economy generates more tax revenue and reduces the need for government spending on social safety nets. However, growth alone is unlikely to solve the debt problem without other fiscal reforms. Inflation. There is a possibility that higher inflation, while harmful in other ways, could reduce the real value of the debt. However, this is a risky strategy, as high inflation can lead to economic instability and hurt average Americans by eroding wages and savings. Why does the U.S. debt matter? The rising national debt has several potential consequences. Higher interest payments. As the debt grows, the government must spend more on interest payments, which means fewer resources for other priorities, such as infrastructure, education, or healthcare. Crowding out investment. Large government borrowing can crowd out private investment by raising interest rates, which can slow down economic growth. In summary, the U.S. debt is a complex issue with deep historical roots and significant future implications. It is a delicate balancing act between maintaining the flexibility to invest in the country's future while managing the growing burden of debt responsibly. Thanks for watching. Request you to subscribe the channel.